The ballroom glittered with 1,000 candles, but Evangeline felt only the cold. She stood at the edge of the dancers, her gloved hands clasped too tightly in front of her, her spine held straight from years of training that had never quite prepared her for this particular torture. Her husband, Alexander Sterling, the Duke of Ravenwood, was dancing with Lady Marguerite Ashby. Again, the same woman he had danced with 3 times this evening. The same woman whose laughter floated across the polished floor like the delicate chime of silver bells. He had not danced with his wife. He had not even looked at her. Evangeline's chest ached with a dull, familiar pain, the kind that had settled into her bones 3 years ago and had never truly left. She wore the Ravenwood sapphires around her throat, a heavy collar of blue fire that belonged to the Duchess. But she felt like an impostor wearing them, a borrowed jewel upon a borrowed woman. She tries so hard, poor thing. The whisper came from somewhere behind her, quiet but deliberate, meant to be overheard. Evangeline did not turn. She had learned that turning only made it worse. The Duke barely tolerates her. Everyone knows he married her out of obligation, not affection. Well, after what her sister did, he was generous to marry her at all. The words slipped under her skin like needles. She kept her gaze fixed on the dancers, on the way Alexander's hand rested at Lady Marguerite's waist with an ease he had never shown her. His dark hair gleamed under the chandeliers, his jaw sharp and unyielding, his expression reserved yet undeniably attentive to the woman in his arms. Once, long ago, Evangeline had imagined herself in that place. She had been 18 when she married him, trembling with hope on their wedding day, believing that kindness and patience would eventually melt the ice around his heart. She had filled Ravenwood Hall with fresh flowers, learned his favorite meals, sat through countless dinners trying to coax conversation from a man who answered only in monosyllables. She had written him letters on the anniversaries of his late mother's passing, left small tokens of comfort on his study desk, and loved him so quietly that she sometimes feared she would disappear into the silence entirely. And in return, he had given her nothing but cold courtesy. The music ended. Alexander escorted Lady Marguerite back to her chaperone, inclining his head with a reserved smile that never reached his eyes. Even that small gesture stung. He was capable of smiling, just not at his wife. Evangeline turned away, slipping through the crowd and out onto the terrace. The night air bit at her bare shoulders, but she welcomed the sting. It was cleaner than the suffocating heat of the ballroom. She pressed a hand to the stone balustrade and breathed, counting the seconds until she could leave this place without further humiliation. Footsteps sounded behind her. For one breathless moment her heart lifted. Perhaps he had noticed her absence. Perhaps he had followed. "Your Grace." It was not Alexander. A footman stood in the doorway holding a silver tray with a letter. This arrived from the continent. The messenger said it was urgent. Evangeline took the letter with trembling fingers. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Lydia. Her sister's sloping, careless script was as familiar as her own heartbeat. She had not seen Lydia in 4 years, not since the scandal that had shattered their family and left Evangeline standing in the wreckage, offering herself as a sacrifice to save their name. She broke the seal and read in the flickering torchlight. "Dearest Evie, I hope this letter finds you well, though I know my name is never spoken in your household. I am writing to tell you that I am happy, truly happy. Charles and I have settled in a small village in Italy, and we have a daughter now. Her name is Clara. She has your eyes. I think of you often. I pray that you have found some peace in the life you chose. I know it was never the life you wanted, and I carry that guilt every day. But I wanted you to know that my freedom came at a cost I never intended you to pay. With all my love, Lydia." Evangeline folded the letter slowly, pressing it to her chest. A sob rose in her throat, but she swallowed it down until it was nothing but a jagged lump of pain. Her sister was free. Her sister had a daughter. Her sister had love. And Evangeline, had a husband who could not bear to look at her. She stood alone on the terrace for a long time, watching the stars wheel overhead, and made a decision that would change everything. She was done waiting. The next morning, Evangeline rose before dawn. She dressed without ringing for her maid, choosing a simple gray gown instead of the elaborate silks expected of a duchess. She pinned her hair back with none of the usual fuss, and when she caught her reflection in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. There were shadows beneath her eyes, yes, a thinness to her cheeks that had not been there a year ago, but there was also something else, something steady, something that had not been there before. Resolve. She walked to the breakfast room at her usual hour, but she did not linger over the table waiting for Alexander to appear. She ate quickly, alone, and then summoned the housekeeper. "I will be visiting the tenant farms today," she said. "Please have a basket of provisions prepared. Bread, cheese, preserves, whatever can be spared." Mrs. Colby blinked in surprise. The Duchess had never taken an interest in the tenants before. "Of course, Your Grace. Shall I inform His Grace?" "No." The word came out sharper than Evangeline intended. She softened her tone. "The Duke is occupied with estate matters. I will not trouble him with such a small errand." It was not a small errand. The tenant farms had been neglected for years, ever since the old Duke passed and Alexander had retreated into his own private sorrows. But Evangeline did not explain herself. She simply took the basket and walked out the door. The first farm she visited belonged to a widow named Agnes, whose husband had died the previous winter. The cottage was cold, the roof patched with little more than hope, and 3 small children huddled around a meager fire. Agnes stared at the Duchess as though she had sprouted wings. "Your Grace," she stammered, dropping into a clumsy curtsy, "we were not expecting." "Please don't." Evangeline set the basket on the table. "I should have come sooner, I am sorry." She spent an hour there, listening to Agnes's worries and the children's shy stories. She promised to send a carpenter for the roof and arranged for extra firewood to be delivered before the first frost. When she left, the children waved at her from the doorway, and something inside her chest unknotted just a little. She visited 3 more farms that day, and then 4 the next. She began visiting the village school, where the teacher was overwhelmed with too many children and too few books. She organized a donation of supplies from the estate's surplus. She started a small sewing circle for the village women, giving them a place to mend clothes and share their troubles. Slowly, quietly, she built a life outside the walls of Ravenwood Hall. And she stopped waiting for Alexander to notice. Weeks passed. The season turned toward autumn, and the leaves on the great oaks that lined the drive blazed red and gold. Evangeline continued her work, rising early and returning late, her hands busy, her heart slowly learning to beat without the constant ache of longing. She was in the village one afternoon, helping the baker's wife settle a dispute over a disputed flour delivery, when she first met Julian Hartley. He was a painter, traveling through the county on commission from Lord Ashworth, who wanted a portrait of his ancestral home. He had kind eyes and an easy smile, and when he saw Evangeline sketching the village church in a small leather-bound book, he stopped in his tracks. "That is remarkable work," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "The way you've captured the light on the stone, forgive me, but are you a professional?" Evangeline flushed, closing the sketchbook quickly. "Hardly, it is only a hobby." "Then you are wasted as a hobbyist." Julian bowed, introducing himself with the easy charm of someone who had never been touched by scandal or sorrow. "I do not mean to intrude, but I have rarely seen such natural talent. Would you permit me to see more of your work?" She should have refused. It was not proper for a duchess to share her private sketches with a stranger, but there was something refreshing about Julian's openness, his lack of awareness of her tragic history. He did not look at her like the replacement bride or the pitiable duchess. He looked at her like an artist seeing a kindred spirit. She opened the sketchbook again. What began as a brief conversation became a friendship. Julian was staying at the village inn while he worked on his commission, and he often walked the same paths Evangeline took on her errands. They would stop and talk, discussing art and light and the quiet beauty of the countryside. He never asked about her marriage, never pried into the shadows behind her eyes. He simply appreciated her company. And Evangeline, starved for so long of simple human warmth, began to look forward to their encounters. Not with any impropriety, she was still a wife, still bound by vows she had never broken, but with a quiet, private gladness. Someone saw her. Someone noticed when she smiled. It was enough, it had to be. Alexander noticed the change before he understood it. At first, it was only a vague sense of wrongness. The house felt different, quieter. He would walk into the breakfast room and find his wife already gone, her plate cleared away before he arrived. He would return from a long day of estate business and expect to see her waiting in the drawing room, a book open on her lap, her eyes lifting with that painful hope he had always pretended not to see. But she was not there, she was never there. He found himself listening for her footsteps in the corridor. He caught himself glancing toward her empty chair at dinner, where once she had filled the silence with gentle, determined conversation. Now the silence was absolute, and he was the one who had to sit in it. One evening, a full month after the ball, he stood in the doorway of her private sitting room. The room was tidy, almost impersonal. The small touches she had once added, fresh flowers, embroidered cushions, a stack of books by the hearth, were gone. The room felt abandoned. A cold unease settled in his chest. He summoned Mrs. Colby. "Where is the Duchess?" The housekeeper hesitated. "She is at the village, Your Grace. She has been spending much of her time there, visiting tenants, organizing the school. She has been quite tireless." Tireless, the word echoed in his mind. When had she become tireless? When had she stopped waiting for him? "I see," he said, and dismissed the housekeeper with a gesture that betrayed none of his disquiet. But that night, he did not sleep. He paced his study, staring at the portrait of his ancestors, feeling the weight of something he could not name pressing against his ribs. The next afternoon, he rode into the village. He told himself it was to inspect the new bridge being built over the stream. But his eyes scanned the green, the bakery, the schoolhouse, searching for a glimpse of her. And then he saw her. She was standing outside the church with a man he did not recognize. A tall man with a painter's satchel slung over one shoulder and an expression of open admiration on his face. He was leaning close to Evangeline, saying something that made her laugh, actually laugh, a soft, surprised sound that Alexander had not heard in years. Something hot and sharp twisted in his gut. He dismounted and walked toward them, his boots striking the cobblestones with deliberate weight. Evangeline looked up, and the laughter died on her lips. Her expression shuddered, becoming politely neutral. The change was so swift it felt like a blow. "Your Grace," she said, inclining her head, "I did not expect to see you here. I had business in the village." His voice was colder than he intended. His gaze flicked to the painter. "I do not believe we have been introduced." Julian bowed, entirely unflustered. "Julian Hartley, Your Grace. I am painting Lord Ashworth's estate. I had the good fortune to encounter the Duchess and admire her remarkable sketches." Her sketches. Alexander had not known she sketched. He had never asked. He had never thought to ask. "Indeed," he said, the word clipped. "We must return to the hall, Evangeline. There are matters to discuss." It was a lie. There were no matters. But the thought of her standing there, laughing with a stranger, was unbearable. He offered her his arm, and after the barest hesitation, she took it. She did not speak on the ride back. She simply sat beside him in the carriage, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the window. The silence between them had never felt so vast. That evening, Alexander retreated to his study and tried to bury himself in ledgers. But the numbers blurred before his eyes. He kept seeing her face, the way she had looked at Hartley. the way she had once looked at him. He opened a drawer in his desk, searching absently for a particular land deed, and his fingers brushed against a stack of old letters tied with a faded ribbon. He had not looked at them in years. They were the letters of condolence he had received after his younger sister, Alina, died of a fever when he was 22. He had been drowning in grief then, barely able to function. And then, out of nowhere, anonymous letters had started arriving. Letters written in a flowing, careful hand, offering comfort without expectation of reply. They had spoken of loss with such gentle understanding that he had read them over and over, clinging to their words like a lifeline. He had never known who sent them. Idly, he untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. I know the world feels hollow right now. I know you cannot imagine waking up to another morning without her, but the love she gave you is not gone. It lives in you. It will become a quiet strength one day, I promise. Until then, let yourself grieve. You do not have to be strong for anyone. Alexander's throat tightened. He had forgotten how much those letters had meant to him. He had assumed they came from some distant cousin or perhaps a family friend. He had never pursued the mystery because some part of him had been afraid to discover the sender was merely a polite acquaintance and not the kindred soul he had imagined. He turned the letter over and froze. On the back in the corner there was a tiny sketch, a sprig of lavender drawn in delicate, precise lines. The same lavender he had seen in a leather-bound sketchbook this afternoon in the hands of his wife. The world tilted. He pulled out the other letters, 5 in total, and found similar sketches on each. A bird in flight, a half-open rose, a candle flame, a winding path through a garden, all of them unmistakably the work of the same hand. Evangeline's hand. She had been the one. All those years ago, before their marriage, before the scandal, before everything, she had been the one who reached out to him in his darkest hour, and he had never known. He had married her out of duty, resenting her for her sister's betrayal, never once looking past his own bitterness to see the woman she truly was. He sat in the lamplight, the letters scattered across his desk, and felt the first crack splinter through the ice around his heart. A week later, a visitor arrived at Ravenwood Hall. Lady Cecily Vance, Alexander's widowed cousin, swept through the front doors with her usual air of entitled elegance. She was a woman of striking beauty and sharp ambition, and she had always made Evangeline feel like a small, shabby thing in comparison. "Darling cousin," Cecily cooed, kissing Alexander's cheek with theatrical affection, "I have been positively starved for your company. And you, dear Evangeline, still managing the household, I see. How industrious you are." Evangeline offered a thin smile. She had long suspected that Cecily's visits were motivated less by affection and more by a desire to remind everyone that she had once been the intended bride of a duke before her own husband's untimely death. But she had never been able to prove the darker suspicion that had festered in her heart for 4 years. That night, unable to sleep, Evangeline walked the silent corridors. She passed the library and heard voices. Cecily's voice, low and smug. "You could have had so much better, Alexander. That whole family is rotten. Lydia ran off because she was faithless, and Evangeline is just as deceitful, I'm certain. She only married you for your title." Evangeline's hand flew to her mouth. She pressed herself against the wall, heart pounding. "That is enough, Cecily." Alexander's voice was flat, but there was an edge to it. "I will not discuss my wife in such terms." "Oh, do not pretend you care for her. Everyone knows the marriage is a farce. The whole county pities you, trapped with the sister of a scandal. I warned you about that family years ago, but you would not listen. I told you Lydia was untrustworthy, and I was right." Evangeline's blood ran cold. "I warned you about that family. I told you Lydia was untrustworthy." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. It had been Cecily who spread the first whispers about Lydia's character before the elopement. Cecily, who had whispered poison into society's ear, ensuring that when Lydia did run away. The scandal was catastrophic. Cecily, who had hoped the engagement would be broken, leaving Alexander free for herself. And when that failed, Cecily had settled for being a permanent thorn in Evangeline's side. Evangeline stepped back from the door, her mind racing. She had no proof. She had only fragments of memory and a gut-deep certainty, but she would not let Cecily poison her life any further, not anymore. The confrontation came 2 days later. Evangeline found Cecily alone in the conservatory, arranging a bouquet of hothouse roses with practiced delicacy. She did not look up as Evangeline entered, only smiled that thin, knowing smile. "Come to enjoy the flowers, dear, or to scowl at me from a corner. You are so very good at lurking." "I know what you did." Cecily's fingers paused on a rose stem. For a heartbeat her expression flickered. Then she laughed, a light, dismissive sound. "I have no idea what you mean." "You orchestrated my sister's ruin," Evangeline said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "You spread rumors. You encouraged the man she eloped with. You made sure everyone believed the worst. You destroyed my family's reputation so that Alexander would break the engagement and turn to you." Cecily's eyes narrowed. "What a vivid imagination you have, and yet you have no proof, do you? Not a single shred." "No," Evangeline admitted, "but I have something better. I have his trust." That was a lie. She did not have Alexander's trust, but Cecily did not know that. And for the first time, uncertainty crept into the widow's gaze. "You are a foolish little girl playing Duchess," Cecily hissed, stepping closer. "You think he will ever love you. You are nothing but a duty he was forced to shoulder, a reminder of everything he lost. He will never see you as anything more." The words hit their mark, but Evangeline did not flinch. She had already faced the worst of her fears. She had already made peace with the possibility that Alexander would never love her, and somehow that peace had made her strong. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "but I am still the Duchess of Ravenwood, and you are merely a guest in my home. Remember that." She turned and walked away, leaving Cecily standing in stunned silence. She did not see Alexander standing in the shadowed corridor beyond the conservatory door, his face pale and stricken, having heard every word. That night a storm rolled in from the sea, lashing the windows of Ravenwood Hall with wind and rain. Evangeline sat in her sitting room, a single candle burning beside her, and wrote a letter of her own. She wrote to Alexander. She did not plead. She did not accuse. She simply told him the truth that had lived inside her for 3 years. She told him that she had loved him since she was 17, since the first time she saw him laugh at a garden party before he had ever looked at her sister. She told him that she had written the anonymous letters after Alina died because she could not bear his suffering. She told him that she had married him hopping foolishly, that he might one day see her as more than a substitute for the bride he had lost. And she told him that she was tired, so terribly tired. She folded the letter and sealed it with wax. She did not know if she would ever give it to him, but writing it felt like releasing a breath she had held for half her life. The next morning, she went to his study. He was there standing by the window, his back to her. His shoulders were rigid, his hands clasped behind him. He did not turn when she entered. "Alexander." He turned then and she saw his face. He looked haggard as though he had not slept at all. His eyes, usually so guarded, were raw with something she could not name. "I heard you," he said, his voice hoarse. "Last night with Cecily." Evangeline's heart stuttered. "You heard?" "I heard her confess. I heard you defend yourself. I heard everything." He took a step toward her, and there was a tremor in his movement she had never seen before. "And I found the letters, your letters, the ones you sent after Alina died." The world seemed to tilt. She opened her mouth, but no words came. "Why did you never tell me?" he demanded, his voice breaking. Why did you let me treat you so coldly when all along it was you? It was always you." Tears burned behind her eyes. "Because you would not have believed me. You did not want to see me, Alexander. You only saw my sister's shadow." He flinched as though she had struck him. "I was a fool." "Yes," she whispered, "you were." She reached into her pocket and drew out the letter she had written the night before. She held it out to him, her hand trembling only a little. "This is everything I have never been able to say. I am giving it to you now because I cannot carry it any longer." He took the letter. His fingers brushed hers, and the touch sent a shock through her entire body. For a long moment they simply stood there, inches apart, the weight of 3 years pressing between them. Then Evangeline turned and walked away. 3 days passed. Evangeline did not see Alexander. He remained in his study or rode out early and returned late. She did not seek him out. She had said what needed to be said. The rest was his choice. On the fourth morning she packed a small bag. She would not leave him. She was still his wife, and she would not bring more scandal upon either of them. But she needed time away. She would visit a distant aunt in the north, someone who had always been kind to her. She needed to breathe air that was not filled with the ghost of her own pain. She was walking toward the carriage when she heard footsteps behind her. "Evangeline." She stopped slowly. She turned. Alexander stood on the gravel drive, his coat undone, his hair wild from the wind. He looked nothing like the cold, composed Duke the world knew. He looked desperate. "Please," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "Please do not go." Her throat tightened. "I am not leaving you, I only need." "I know what you need." He closed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching her. "You need to be seen. You need to be loved. And I have failed you in every possible way. But I am begging you, Evangeline. Give me one chance to make it right. I will spend the rest of my life trying if you will let me." She searched his face, looking for the coldness that had always been there. But it was gone. In its place was something raw and tender and terrified. "I read your letter," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I read it 12 times, and I realized I have loved you for longer than I ever admitted to myself. I loved you when you filled this house with flowers. I loved you when you wrote those letters and never asked for anything in return. I loved you when you faced Cecily with more courage than I have ever shown. But I was too proud and too blind and too broken to see it." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box. He opened it, and inside lay a ring. Not the heavy ravenwood sapphire she wore as a duty, but a delicate band of gold set with a single pearl, simple and luminous. "This was my mother," he said. "She told me to give it to the woman I loved beyond all reason. I should have given it to you on our wedding day. I am giving it to you now if you will still have me." Evangeline stared at the ring, and the tears she had been holding back for 3 years spilled down her cheeks. "You hurt me," she said, her voice breaking. "You made me feel invisible." "I know." His own eyes glistened. "And I will spend every day of my life trying to heal that hurt, if you let me." The carriage driver cleared his throat very softly. A bird sang in the oak tree above them. The world went on, unbothered by the breaking and mending of hearts. Evangeline reached out and took the ring. She slipped it onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting for her all along. "One chance," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "That is all I can promise." Alexander exhaled a breath that was almost a sob. He reached for her hand, cradling it in both of his, and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a tenderness that shattered the last of her defenses. "Then I will make it enough," he said. And for the first time in 3 years, when Evangeline looked at her husband, she saw not a stranger, but a man who had finally, truly come home. They did not heal overnight. Healing, Evangeline learned, was not a single moment of revelation, but a slow, careful stitching of wounds that had been left open too long. The first change was the simplest. Alexander began to eat breakfast with her, not in silence as before but with hesitant conversation. He asked about her day. He listened when she spoke about the tenants, the school, the sewing circle. He did not yet know how to be warm, but he was trying. And she saw the effort in every awkward pause and too earnest question. The second change was Julian Hartley. He finished his commission and left the village, but not before Alexander sought him out privately and thanked him, genuinely thanked him, for being a friend to his wife when she had needed one. Evangeline learned of this only later from a servant who had overheard, and she wept quietly in her room, not from sorrow but from the overwhelming relief of being understood at last. The third change was Cecily. She departed Ravenwood Hall the morning after the storm, her face a mask of icy fury, and was not invited back. Alexander made it clear, in a letter so cold it might have been carved from winter air, that her presence was no longer welcome. The whispers in society shifted, as whispers do, and Evangeline found herself gradually accepted, not as a scandalous replacement but as a duchess who had earned her place. But the truest change happened in the quiet moments. On an evening in late autumn when the last leaves were falling and the fire crackled in the hearth, Alexander found Evangeline in the library. She was sketching again, her brow furrowed in concentration. He sat down beside her, not too close, respecting the careful distance she still sometimes needed. "May I see?" he asked. She hesitated, then turned the sketchbook toward him. It was a drawing of the village church, the light falling through the stained glass in shafts of imagined radiance. "It is beautiful," he said, and meant it. "You have a gift." "Thank you." She looked at him, and for the first time in years there was no guardedness in her expression. "It helps me remember that there is beauty in the world, even when I cannot feel it." He took her hand, the one that wore his mother's pearl. "I want you to feel it," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I want to show you all the beauty you have been denied, if you will let me." Evangeline looked at their joined hands, at the pearl that gleamed like a tiny moon, and felt the last of her winter begin to thaw. "I will try," she said, "but you must promise me something." "Anything." "Promise me you will never again look through me as though I am invisible, even if you are angry, even if you are hurting. I would rather you shout at me than ignore me. The silence is what nearly broke me." His jaw tightened with remorse. "I promise," he said. "On my life, Evangeline, I will never be silent with you again." She believed him, and that perhaps was the greatest miracle of all. Winter arrived, wrapping Ravenwood Hall in a blanket of snow. The tenants were warm, thanks to the firewood deliveries Evangeline had organized. The schoolhouse had a new roof and a full shelf of books. The village hummed with quiet contentment, and the Duchess who walked its streets was no longer a ghost but a beloved fixture, greeting everyone by name. And the Duke who accompanied her, his arm linked through hers, was no longer a cold and distant figure, but a man who laughed openly when children pelted him with snowballs, and who carried a basket of bread to the widow Agnes with his own hands. It was on one such snowy afternoon that Alexander led Evangeline to a part of the estate she had never seen. A small, hidden garden, sheltered by old stone walls, where a single winter rose bloomed defiantly against the frost. "My mother planted this garden," he said, his breath misting in the cold air. "She called it her secret heart. She said that even in the deepest winter there is always something waiting to bloom." Evangeline touched the velvety petals, her heart full. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because you are my secret heart," he said simply. "You were always there, blooming in the cold I created around myself. I was too blind to see it, but I see it now." She turned to him, and the love that rose in her chest was no longer painful. It was warm, steady, hopeful. "I loved you in silence for so long," she whispered. "I do not want to be silent anymore." "Then speak," he said, cupping her face in his gloved hands. "Tell me everything. I will spend the rest of my life listening." She smiled, the first full, unguarded smile she had worn in years. "I love you, Alexander Sterling. I have loved you since I was 17 years old, and I will love you until I am old and gray and the stars have burned away." His breath caught. "I loved you too late," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I love you now with everything I have, everything I am." He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was not hurried or demanding, but gentle and reverent, a promise sealed in the cold winter air. The snow began to fall around them, soft and silent, and Evangeline closed her eyes and let herself be held. After so many years of winter, spring was finally beginning. The seasons turned, as seasons do. By the following summer, the whispers had faded entirely. No one spoke of the scandal anymore, or the replacement bride, or the cold duke who had once ignored his wife. They spoke instead of the Duke and Duchess of Ravenwood, who walked arm in arm through the village, who hosted generous feasts for the tenants, who looked at each other across crowded ballrooms with an intimacy that made even the most cynical hearts sigh. And they spoke of the new nursery being prepared at Ravenwood Hall, decorated with murals painted by the Duchess herself, a garden of lavender and roses, filled with birds in flight and winding paths that led to secret hearts. On a warm June morning, Evangeline stood in that nursery, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, and watched Alexander paint the final bird on the wall. He had insisted on helping, though his artistic skills were far inferior to hers. The bird looked slightly lopsided, its beak too large and its wings too small. "It is a very earnest bird," Evangeline said diplomatically. Alexander laughed, setting down the brush and wiping paint from his fingers. "It is a terrible bird, but it is painted with great love. That is what matters." He crossed the room and drew her into his arms, careful and tender. "Are you happy?" he asked, the question that had become their quiet ritual, asked every morning and every night, a promise to never again take each other for granted. Evangeline looked up at her husband, at the man who had once been a stranger and was now the other half of her soul. She thought of the girl she had been, standing alone on a moonlit terrace, her heart shattered in the silence. She thought of the woman she had become, strong and seen and cherished. "Yes," she said, and the word was as full as the dawn, "I am happy." She pressed her cheek to his chest and listened to the steady rhythm of his heart, the sound that had finally learned to beat in time with her own. And in the room that would soon hold new life, surrounded by painted flowers and imperfect birds and the quiet, enduring warmth of a love-hard one, Evangeline closed her eyes and let herself rest. She was no longer the Duchess he never wanted. She was the Duchess he could not live without. And that, she knew, was a far better story. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. Your support means a lot to us. Thank you for watching and see you in the next amazing story.